could, let's say in a 10 years' time, be regarded as something historic. We are discussing actually a development which could replace the spirit of Silicon Valley in terms of digitalization and something completely different what we had been experiencing until now. It is concerning on the one hand, and the other one is also interesting, and there's always also a good side about bad things. So we are curious to hear more about the developments, and I'm very happy also that my friend, a good old friend, Jo Leinen, the chair of the EP delegation for relations with the People's Republic of China, is also here, and he will start with some fundamental remarks, and then we have a, I think, very interesting panel of speakers who will explain the developments to you. I do not go into the introduction of the speakers now, because I will do that then one by one when I call you for your contributions. And I just want to inform you that this meeting is web streamed, so we have also audience outside who is also watching the discussions. So, Jo, the floor is yours, and I ask you to start.
Yeah, from Joe to Joe. Thank you, Joe Weidenholzer to Jo Leinen.
Old man don't
Yeah, welcome everybody. I think this is the most important issue to discuss human rights in the digital age, and take China as a case to look into this phenomena, how freedom is exercised and on the other hand is restricted through the possibilities of the applications of the internet. Yeah, I chair the delegation towards the People's Republic in China, and our delegation had a few meetings with the same topic in the last years. China, this emerging power and economy, has decided to be a world leader in new technologies. They have defined 10 key areas in that concept of Made in China 2025, where they want to catch up with us in the West, the United States and Europe, and clearly to be the leader. And one of the areas is the internet, and there especially artificial intelligence. And one could see that among the global champions in this area, there are, of course, the leading US companies from the Silicon Valley, but there are more and more Chinese companies. And the first European company comes very, very late. SAP from Heidelberg is far back. So this world so far is dominated by America, the US, and China on the other hand. China is in this world of internet, let's say, quickly on equal footing to us, and I must say they are at least 5 to 10 years advanced. I was in the Green Week visiting China, and in Shenzhen. We went up this mountain where Deng Xiaoping has his monument, and it was 30 degrees, and I wanted to take a Coca-Cola out of a service box, and my 10 yuan came back. So I turned them, put them in, the 10 yuan came out, and Chinese colleague came and said, no, you have to pay by mobile. We have no more money in this town. You pay by mobile. And I was astonished that even not a mineral water or a Coca-Cola you can pay. It is all by mobile. And even the one who was begging in the street, he had his mobile, and the people put down their mobile, and then you pay the amount of money that you want to give to a person. So internet and internet services are all around. China is then investing in artificial intelligence, especially face recognition, and that leads then to our more concrete topic, how is that used? I see that human rights are not the same definition in China than we define it. Even China has signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They have more the social rights and economic rights in the forefront and not the individual rights as we see it. And the Chinese government, even on the Human Rights Council in Geneva, is trying to differentiate this Universal Declaration and saying, look, we are champion in human rights because we took 700 million people out of poverty. So there are social rights that people enjoy. And that I mention this because you would discover that in the Chinese society, most people, as one could see, and I even in talks with them could hear, they have not so big problems with the data that are collected by Alipay. On the one hand, this tool that is number one in China, or WeChat from Tencent on the other hand. They think that this is okay because it allows them a modern life. And with Alipay, you can do much more than you can do with WhatsApp. You can not only send messages, but you can book a restaurant, you can pay in the supermarket, you can pay your electric bill, you can look for a job, company owner can, let's say, give credits to the consumers, so they have a wide range of applications, and this new brave modern world is so fantastic for most Chinese people that they enjoy it, they participate, and they think that's okay. Now that is the private company side to exploit the digital world, and then comes, of course, the Chinese state. And there we learned that, of course, you have monitors everywhere in public spaces in China, and that there is this social credit system where pilot projects are now all over the country. This was born in 2014 to use the internet for collecting data about the citizens and have this social credit system where you get minus and plus. And if you have some sort of minus, you are exempted from high-speed trains, you don't get flight tickets, you cannot study, you might not get a job that you want, and so on, or an apartment in some areas of the cities. I think that the internet and these practices are touching quite a lot of articles of the Human Rights Declarations. Article 2, the interdiction of discrimination. Article 12, the right of private sphere, that you have a right of a private sphere. Article 13, right of free moving. Article 17, right of property. Article 18, right of religion and free thinking. And Article 26, right of education, and so on. So you could see that this system is affecting human rights if it is misused or excessively used. Now, one could then, of course, ask, is it a singular case for China? But I think we all have the feeling that if this is working quite well, and I have no doubt that it will work quite well, it will copy it. And looking around the world, I could already see a lot of countries that would buy off from Chinese companies and maybe from Chinese state entities the system to apply it in their own country. And therefore, this is going to be a global universal concern to really discuss these issues and to counteract and to see on whatever tool and instrument we have to have a global conduct, even global rules. And the EU is not a military power, we are even not a big political power, but we are a world power in standards. And I think it's up to us in the EU to set global standards in the use of the internet and the human rights that the people should enjoy on this world. Yeah, maybe that is my introduction. I could be much more longer, but we have so fine experts on the podium that there will become much more of it. And that is really an important issue. I'm happy from my delegation, Joe, to have it in our political group. And I think Birgit and the Libe committee that touches to your business, and it should be concerned for the whole of the parliament. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The system is like this, that after a contribution you have some time for questions. If someone wants to raise a question now, you are welcome. Otherwise, I think, because this was more a general introduction, I really appreciate, because it is really something, as I already stressed, something historic what is going on. So we might really, in a few years' time, have a complete different environment what is now being shaped in China. So this is very important. And I'm very happy to have Jeremy Thome with me, who is actually a commuter between the two worlds, and he knows the Western world and he knows the Chinese world, and he's now currently based in Beijing with extensive experience working in China on collaborative legal reform projects. Before joining the Paul Tsai China Center, he worked with the New York University US Asia Law Institute, focusing on China-based programs. So I think he is really the expert for the questions, and the floor is yours. If you have something like 15, 20 minutes, yeah, would be fine, yeah? You have a presentation, and then we open the floor for discussions.
Yeah. So thank you very much for that introduction. I think there's no question about the importance of this topic. I think globally, technology's interaction with human rights is going to be increasingly important, and China has, as we just heard, consciously decided to try and take a lead in it. I'm sorry to say I know less of the U.S. and Western world at this point than I do of China, having studied it for 10 years and having lived in China for the last 6. It's quite refreshing to be in Europe and to start to get a little bit of a feel, even if I'm here for a very brief time. As you mentioned, I work in a law school. My focus is law, and specifically criminal procedure. And I will be approaching this discussion of the social credit system that we touched upon from a legal aspect. And it is very much a legal system. China is very much a regulatory state, and things tend to be written down as legal documents. As a scholar of criminal procedure, my focus is about state deprivation of basic rights. This is the essence of the criminal laws, under what situations the state should be allowed to deprive a person of its rights. So social credit is actually a bit outside of my normal focus. But when I started hearing all the reporting about this system, I wanted to take a closer look because it sounded like people were losing some fundamental freedoms without due process, as we would have in the criminal system. Now, immediately, I will address some of the misconceptions, because I suspect many of you have already read some articles or seen some television programs about the social credit system. And I think that many of us on this panel actually will be addressing the social credit system. So the first point is especially important, which is that social credit tends to get used as a catch-all phrase for all invasive technology in China. And I can tell you that in my normal focus of study, criminal procedure, there are many other invasions of privacy that use technology. I work directly with Chinese police and prosecutors in much of the cooperative work that I do. And I can tell you that as far as data privacy rights go, once the Chinese police have opened a case investigating you, they will have access to any information they want. There are search warrants in China, but they're issued by higher-level police to lower-level police. There's not an external check. They consider that to be sufficient protections. But it means that they will get it. The law assumes that the police will protect the privacy of any commercial secrets or personal information they come across. Their privacy rights exist between individuals much more than between the state. Now, does that mean that police are constantly looking at everyone's information? I use WeChat. They might be looking at mine because I do some sensitive things. But I don't think they have the resources or interest in processing that data. What they much prefer to do is to outsource it to the companies, to be on the lookout for illegal content. And we've seen a lot of regulations, including in chat groups, online forums, basically any communications device, where they ask the leader or platform to report illegal content being transmitted and provide a legal responsibility. The second misconception about social credit is that it's actually about organizations, legal persons, more than it is about individuals. So it's less likely to involve these privacy concerns because it's really focused on a regulatory aspect. And we'll get into that in more detail. The third is scores. Everywhere we hear this notion of a generalized citizenship score with the additions and reductions for various things. The truth is that social credit is a very disparate, siloed system, and we'll get into the specifics of the legalities in a minute, but there is no general score. There have been some in pilots that I will address in a moment, but largely speaking, there is no general score. That is not what social credit is. What is it? I'll get into in a moment, I promise. The final is that it will be fully in place by 2020. China, like former Soviet Union, loves to work on 5- and 6-year plans. And this 2020 date comes from the fact that its first plan was from 2014 through 2020. The concept of social credit was actually initially raised in the early 2000s, but this plan is the first major push with real goals and deadlines. The truth is much of the system is already in place now. There are dates for what goals should be accomplished by which dates. Most of the stuff is already happening now. I suspect that in 2020 we will see another 5-year plan, 2020 through X. Okay, so let's talk about what social credit is. It covers a really diverse range of sectors. The first is this government affairs, which surprises a lot of people. The system is about, in part, regulating the government. And it emphasizes government transparency, public supervision of the government, a phrase that they like to use a lot. And the idea is that it will help regulate officials, make sure they're following the party line and the rules. The most substantial portion is the next one, commercial enterprises. The vast majority of the text of social credit planning document, that 2014 through 2020 guide, covers regulating the commercial sector. And it is about enforcing existing regulatory law. It's not really new obligations. Were I a lawyer counseling corporations, I would have some concerns for them about enforcement of those existing laws, but I wouldn't really tell them there's new obligations under it. It's more about aggregating the data. The final is social organizations and welfare, helping people to judge charities. The philanthropic sector is relatively new in China and has been developing under a new charitable law. And this is the idea that we will keep some sort of records about the legitimacy of charities. And the last that is very important is the justice sector, which is mainly about enforcing court judgments. Now, I break it down into some conceptual areas that are my own, and these don't appear in the documents. But these are financial, which uses a special term, zhengxin, which is usually translated by me as credit reporting. This is a financial program. This is about making sure that credit can reach the great unbanked or underbanked in China, which is about 2/3 of the people are not touched by the bank's own credit system. And I think it's pretty intuitive. Every government would like to make credit extend so that the economy can develop in that fashion. The second is regulatory, which is the most effective, most currently implemented piece of the social credit system, which is about enhanced enforcement of existing laws. And I'll go into each of these in more detail. And the third, that is most troubling in sort of a philosophical sense, but the least troubling in an operational sense, is an educational or moral component. And you can see here I've put a special terminology again, chengxin, which the government has as one of its core socialist values, a big program right now. They call it integrity. I translate it as creditworthiness because I have too many associations with the word integrity, about structural integrity and unification of a person's personality. It's a very philosophical word. I think creditworthiness, but remembering that it has a moral component in here. So these are the three prongs, and these almost are totally isolated from each other. We'll go into more detail about them. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the financial and educational moral, because to me the regulatory, as a criminal procedure scholar, is by far the most interesting, because this is what has consequences for people in terms of deprivation of rights, the things like the high-speed trains and the airplanes that we heard about. Briefly, because it is important to understanding some of the misreporting on the social credit system, the financial system was about well, first I should say that the People's Bank of China has for quite some time had its own credit reporting system. The problem is that it reaches very few of people in China, relatively speaking, about 1/3 of them last I checked. And they wanted to extend it, but most people will never borrow money from a bank, don't own real property, and it's very hard to assign them a credit rating. So what did the government do? Well, they tapped 8 countries that had some natural advantages to create their own credit reporting systems. The most famous of these is the Ali Empire, the Alibaba Empire's Sesame Credit, which is under Ant Financial. And they have a lot of data from that ubiquitous payment system that we all use. It's true. We pay for literally everything, including beggars on the street, with our mobile phones at this point. And they have all of this data about consumers. Now, it's proprietary data, so they're probably not so ready to share it with people, but they were happy to try and assign a score to it. That score is separate from any government score, though. In fact, of these companies that create these 8 companies, ultimately the People's Bank of China did not give any of them a license. They decided that all of them had inherent conflicts of interest in creating a score for people. Now, they're still practicing in a pilot mode, but none of them was granted the official standing as a credit reporting company. Why not? Well, Ali's system, Sesame Credit, for example, required purchasing through Ali products and on their online platform to get a better score. That doesn't give you such great insight into whether a person has the ability to repay loans, which is what financial credit scores really is about, measuring that risk. So none of them was licensed. They found that they were not terribly predictive of the key factor, and they had a conflict of interest. They still exist, and the way that they're expanding now to try and become more credible is that the government has facilitated those 8 companies becoming equal shareholders in a new database of internet lending resources called Baihang, which has a lot of lending data from internet small microloan companies. And hopefully they'll each add that to their existing data pool to go further and creating a better score. Now here's where things get interesting in the regulatory system. This is where state power becomes more prominent. The first part, and not often enough discussed, is real name registration systems. And this means that now in China, doing almost anything requires you to leave your citizen identification number, if you're a real person, or if you're a corporation, a unique identifying social credit code that was created by combining several existing codes and numbers, business licenses, et cetera, into, I think it's a 15-digit code. But when you open an internet account to have access to the internet, be it mobile or at home, you must have it in your real name. There's a limit to how many phones a person can get so that you don't get multiple accounts and give them out to various people, so that they can find out what was done by what person at any time. Again, from my criminal procedure experience, do I believe that there's somebody real-time watching this? No, I don't think that's practical or feasible at this point, although maybe as AI develops, that would become something more feasible. But I think it makes it so that there's a record. And should you become a sensitive person in China, which can be for many reasons, political and otherwise, should that happen, then they can find out everything you've done that left a digital footprint because it's all tied. Every bank account, every internet account, every phone call is all tied to your real ID. Now, is it scored and qualified in some way? No, not yet. But this record does exist. The second part of it is industry-specific blacklists. What happened is the central government asked every regulatory body, that's things like the Food and Drug Administration, things like the workplace safety evaluators, to create a blacklist and something a little less than a blacklist, like a trouble list, of violations that are within their authority. And they, so it was already things that they had jurisdiction over, but they said, well, these are the most serious ones. You get on a blacklist if you get found guilty of this offense. And something a little less than that, you get put on a key scrutiny list. And this is mainly, again, about organizations then, because it's like if a food safety organization has an unclean factory that doesn't meet standards, they might get on the warning list. If they're actually endangering people's physical health, they'll probably get on a blacklist. The consequences of being on a blacklist, much like the reasons and standards for getting on a blacklist, tend to be industry specific. So the consequences generally for being on a food safety blacklist, et cetera, is that you will have more frequent evaluations of your factories, more frequent inspections. And should you apply for government subsidies or for government support or new licenses, you will get a further level of scrutiny. And the last step, which is what bothers the most people, is joint enforcement. And that's where different agencies agree to enforce each other's blacklists. So that means that if you had a serious enough violation in one area, another agency might agree that they would use their authority to put some restrictions on you. The best example here is the court's own blacklist, which accounts for the vast majority of joint punishment in China's social credit right now. And they do put out a monthly report of everyone who's being punished through these mechanisms and how many people are through which system. So you can see that the vast majority of it, 90% plus, is about the court system. And what their standard is that if you have failed to perform on a court judgment, you get put on a list that brings a whole panoply of consequences, including not being allowed to fly on airplanes in China, not being able to go on the best trains in China, your children not being allowed to study at fancy private schools. But these consequences only relate to court judgment defaulters. It's an enforcement mechanism for the courts. But you can see how they do it. The Ministry of Civil Aviation blocks people from flying. They've signed an agreement with the courts agreeing to that. The Ministry of Education tells the schools who's on that list so that they can block it. It's through these memorandums of cooperation on joint enforcement. Right now, there are 39 memorandums of coordination. They keep adding a few of them. The most recent was for social insurance. Now, the final component is the educational component, and it includes moral education, but it also includes education on financial credit. And it's done both in schools and through outreach and publicity. I put the point scoring systems that do exist, and there are a few. Rongcheng gets raised a lot. Shanghai has a little system, and Beijing just announced that they will be putting a point scoring system, which I will get to be a part of by the end of 2020. I put these in the educational section. Why do I put them in the educational system? Is because, one, there aren't really consequences. Unlike the blacklists, which can result in industry-specific or larger consequences, I have not seen any deprivation of rights related to this educational scoring systems. What you do get are some rewards that are similar to what used to exist under programs like model worker programs or Most Beautiful Family. My neighborhood committee every month puts up a picture of the most beautiful most wonderful family in the neighborhood and tells someone's story, and they get some prize. But it's not something anyone would be afraid of. I put the Chinese at the bottom, this 不敢,不会,不想, because this is a phrase that gets used a lot in discussion of anti-corruption, but also of enforcement. What it means is don't dare, cannot, and don't want to, loosely. The idea is that this is a progression for corruption, but also for all violations of the law. And I think that social credit is very much modeled on this. The first step, 不敢, being afraid to do it, is to make people scared of having a violation. It's to make people fear that there's penalties that might be put on them. The 不会 means that the system is so complete that it's impossible to be corrupt, to break the law, that it would be found out before it happened. And the last is an educational ideal, this 不想, don't want to, where we've all been educated to believe in honesty and truth that you don't want to. It's the dilemma that comes up a lot. I have a lot of friends who enjoy first-person shooter video games where they run around shooting people, and I ask them why, and they say, well, because in real life I'll never get to shoot somebody. And I look at them and I say, oh, see, I just don't want to shoot somebody. and I think that that's the progression we're going to. Of course, they're allowed to play their games. So I want to spend a few seconds at the end here talking about the real problems that do exist with social credit. And again, remember that I'm not using social credit to mean all use of technology by the Chinese government, because there are other programs that we can discuss as well that are troubling. But with social credit, the first is that real name registration system and the lack of anonymity. I think anonymity is a right. It's part of privacy. Even though you're often allowed to register your real name with the government only and then have some sort of an alias or nickname on an internet forum or on your chat group, I think knowing even that the government has access to that is a real chilling effect on speech. Not just dissent and illegal activity, but what about unpopular opinions? Christianity in China right now is not favored, even though there's nominally freedom of religion. Islam as well. Homosexuality in a great number of countries still. There's some things that you might want to be able to talk about anonymously, and you shouldn't have to worry about whether or not you can. The second is that will joint enforcement expand? Right now, like I said, it's joint enforcement for violations is constrained by these memorandums of cooperation, where generally speaking, it's not globalized at all. Your consequences in one area are met by punishments in that sector. But if it was expanded, which could conceivably happen, you'd get something similarly to the traditional notion of outlawry, where if you violated the laws, then you no longer get the protections of the laws. And we're going to come at you until it starts to sound like what the Chinese slogans are, which is that violations or untrustworthiness in one area results in restrictions in all areas. And the last real problem, which is the most present one, is the increased enforcement of bad laws. I've emphasized that what social credit is doing is not creating new obligations so much as more deeply enforcing existing law. But if those laws are unjust, further enforcement of them is going to be further unjust. China has restrictions on freedom of speech, restrictions on practice of religion, that, and some just irrational laws about nomenclature of Taiwan on websites that foreign companies have had to deal with. And they will use this to further enforce those bad rules. So making sure, saying that it only enforces laws does not mean it's good or that it complies with rule of law. It can only do so as much as the existing laws do. Now, I think this topic, despite everything I've just said about a lot of it being mythos surrounding social credit, is an important one. And I've begun thinking of it in terms of two dueling dystopian tropes. The first is the dominant media trope of Big Brother meets Big Data that we hear about. The idea of an all-seeing state, the rise of technology and data. And these are global concerns. As was mentioned in the introduction, it is not solely a Chinese issue. And I think that in many ways we use China as a distant, much the way we use science fiction. It's a remote, literally the other side of the world from the United States model that we can look at and project our own anxieties on and sort of talk about them in the abstract. But of course, China is very much a real place, and it's important to understand the difference between our exploration of our own concerns about technology, corporate or government panopticons, and what's actually happening in China. The second dystopia that I see is about China international relations, and I call it fake news because this is our phrase of the day. But for fake news, we have a situation where the reporting on social credit has been so out of line with reality in many situations that even to experts like the people who will speak to you today, it makes us question what we know. And it makes us question what we know not just about this system, but about more important issues. Because the truth of the matter is, both social credit and many more, much more prominent human rights abuses, like what's happening in the Xinjiang region to the Uyghur minority and other Muslims, you begin to doubt what you know about those as well, because our only source of information is the media. And in China particularly, where there's tight media controls and tight access to information, when there's wrong reporting from the other sources and your only source you have is the government source, it leads you to this idea that we can never know anything. And this is perhaps another aspect of technology that's impacting us all. It's almost a technological solipsism that's happening, where you sort of throw your hands up and say, well, what can I know? And my government is not helping it. I use the term fake news in part because we have been challenging every bit of reality that we can. I want to say a few things about China in response to the introduction. I'm probably over time at this point, but I do want to quickly just say that while China has access to much more data through its large population and its total integration of many mobile network devices, it doesn't always have good data. And more isn't necessarily good. You have to have the ability to process it, even if it was reliable data. And as China admits readily itself, they don't have reliable data. Some of the numbers from purchasing, yes, but the governments lie and alters at lower levels, lie and fabricate statistics regularly. So that data will probably be misleading and result in bad decisions if relied on too much. I do think it's interesting that while China is very much at the head of AI development and running ahead of the U.S. and even in many ways. It's curious that when we talk about Chinese technology, we tend to say they have no capacity to innovate. And yet, when it comes to technology that might be oppressive, we're ready to say that, well, they're surely at the head of the game and are making massive innovations. One thing that I suggest to every reporter who asks me about social credit and use of technology in China is to first look at organizations, NGOs abroad, like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF in the US, because many of the ideas that are happening in China are actually being run in the US first. And the US has clear channels for challenging them. And that's the real difference, is that in the US, as a lawyer, I would know how to go to court and challenge a rule once it was being put in place, challenge a new program. In China, that simply isn't possible, and there is no room for civil society like the EFF to be giving us this data. I know that others have much to say, so I'm going to stop here. But we can also discuss other areas of technology during the questioning session. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think this was a really, very important start of our discussion. I would suggest that we just raise questions, and if you have contributions, save it for a later stage, because also we want also to hear what our other colleagues have to say. So short questions, 1, 2, indicate. So I'm taking 2 questions, and yes.
Yes.
If you want to introduce yourself,
sure.
you are invited.
I'm Dini from Wikimedia, and I want to ask, most credit score systems do have a time limit. So, if I've infringed the rules and after a while my record will be cleared, so, I'm free to do things again. How is that in China? Is there a time limit, or is everything recorded and indefinitely?
Yeah, a very good question. And when you look at the few places that have fully functional rule systems for an overall social credit system, or when you look at those financial exclusive credit systems, they both have time limits. It's usually 5 years. I think there are some exceptions where it's a 10-year thing. And there's also in that period applying to have something removed or corrected. Of course, these systems are great in practice, but there's been reported bureaucratic issues, people who didn't get alerted that some information was on their record or tried to get it removed or corrected and couldn't. But generally speaking, even those administrative violations that get you blacklisted in an industry-specific blacklist tend to have a 5-year limit.
Hello, my name is João Silva. I'm coming from the European Data Protection Board. The question would be, we'd be interested in knowing, if you know, of course, whether there's any kind of requirement for Chinese companies abroad to actually send their data back to China to feed these scores, or is this more of an internal issue in terms of, or even perhaps not necessarily just an internal issue, but even sending back data from Chinese citizens abroad? If there's any connection of data, for instance, in this case, Europe, which is what would be interesting for us, but also neighboring countries, to send it through. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's an interesting issue. For Chinese corporations, especially that touches on the personal data of Chinese citizens, there are rules now about it needing to be sent back and kept and stored on servers located domestically, so it would be accessible to the government, and that's in part viewed as a protection for the citizens' personal data. As it relates to foreigners' personal information, or citizens of the country where they're doing business abroad, I don't think it's as clear yet. But I have spoken to people at various ones of these private companies trying to do credit reporting, and they're worried about the bad press of social credit. And I said to them that honestly, I think the biggest stumbling block will be privacy concerns, because I think it's very unrealistic to think that a company wouldn't comply with at least a request of the police in China. And like I said, once a criminal investigation, including some crimes that we might not think of as so criminal, once an investigation begins, the police will certainly have access to data if they want it, even overseas data.
Thank you. Other questions for the moment? We save comments for a later stage. So then, Thank you for the moment. I will now ask the next speaker, Shazida Ahmed. She's a PhD student at the University of California. She has previously worked as a researcher for the Citizen Lab, the Mercator Institute for China Studies, the Council on Foreign Relations, Acer Society, and the Ranking Digital Rights Corporate Transparency Review by New America. In the 2018-19 academic year, she has been a Beijing University-based Fulbright Fellow researching public-private partnerships in the development of China's social credit system. The floor is yours.
Hi. Today, I'm going to be talking about social credit on the ground, policy deliberations, and technological implementation. As mentioned in my introduction, my research is on how tech companies work with the Chinese government, both at a national level and at municipal and provincial levels, to build out the technological infrastructure of the social credit system. So the presentation will follow the same structure. For the first half, I'm going to talk about some of the ways in which some of the kind of current and still emerging social credit policies are thinking about issues such as data protection, privacy, the potential for government abuse of data, to give a sense of what the space for thinking about ethics in terms of social credit is like in China, and also to draw attention to some of the kind of oversights in that system. And then second, I will shift to talking about how the tech sector, in its efforts to build some of the tech infrastructure, are not necessarily thinking about those issues, or at least on the surface, are not documenting that they're thinking about these issues. So first, I'm going to talk about some of the protections being built into the social credit system at a policy level. Now, as Jeremy mentioned, different provinces, different cities are developing their own local regulations, some of which have already gone into effect, some of which are still being developed, many of which are similar. There's sort of boilerplate language that you'll see adopted across different localities, and some of which are quite different. Shanghai is an example that comes up often because Shanghai was a forerunner in developing their own local regulations. And one of the articles in their regulations, as translated by Jeremy, is that the collection of information on natural persons' religious faith, genetics, fingerprints, blood type, illnesses, or medical history is prohibited, as well as other personal information which laws and administrative regulations prohibit the collection of. So there is a consideration of the kinds of data that should not be considered public credit data, as opposed to market credit data, which I'll get into a bit later, and that's sort of data that is pulled from the private sector, tech companies, other companies. But Shanghai, in adopting this regulation, other cities you'll see sometimes pull this exact line into their policies. The counterpoint might be, well, how do we know that other data that's being collected couldn't be used to extrapolate this information? And I unfortunately have not yet seen a discussion of that particular issue in China. As Jeremy mentioned, there are mechanisms for contestation and remedy. In particular, if people think that they were maybe incorrectly blacklisted or some of the information on their record is incorrect. Different provinces, different cities have different regulations regarding how you can contest and remedy that misinformation. The example I've pulled from here, Shanghai has been one of the more, let's say, transparent provinces to publish how their setup of their public credit information service platform has been going. So this is taken from a Shanghai government report. In 2017, the number of natural persons, as distinguished from legal persons, to have filed for corrections to their records was 739. And allegedly, 739 of those records had some change made. This final number, 0, is if there was a follow-up after the change was made. So the suggestion is 0 of the times were there still outstanding errors after the filing for the contestation, the remedy was made. So Shanghai is among one of many cities that actually explicitly says within X number of days, in Shanghai it's 5 days of requesting that your file be viewed for potential revisions, there will be a decision made. However, and this is what I find kind of interesting about the governments that choose to publish this data, there's not a lot of detail about the process that the government went through in determining that the information was incorrect, in changing it. If any of that deliberation is made accessible to the people asking for it. And this is something I kind of wonder if many people even know is an option available to them, given how few people have kind of heard of their local pilot tests regarding social credit. And that's something I think future research will have to address, is do people even understand that these are mechanisms available to them? There are also protections against data tampering and abuse. However, I will say, in the policies, most of what's punishable is government abuse and tampering with data. So provinces like Hubei, Shanghai, they have restrictions on if government employees leak and falsify credit data, as well as if they access data outside of their authority. There are fines of up to tens of thousands of RMB. However, there isn't much of a discussion in these regulations about what happens if an external, a non-governmental party accesses this information and does any of these things to it, and what the punishments for that might be. However, something that is interesting and somewhat innovative, and it's in an even smaller subset of regulations, is that some of these provincial municipal policies are calling for the creation of query logs that will record when a specific government employee accesses this data, how frequently, for how long, and that will sort of create a paper trail of who is looking at this data and why. So there are a number of debates emerging within China among policymakers, legal experts, and to a smaller extent in the public sphere. So from some of my interviews, preliminary debates that I'm seeing emerging, I've heard, lawyers are suggesting, well, should these social credit regulations, such as the article I presented from Shanghai, be developed prior to the creation of a national privacy law? Well, what if a national privacy law is developed and it says something completely different about what kinds of data should or should not be collected? Will the social credit regulations have to change? Another question I've heard a few people raise, so these are people, legal experts, who were consulted by the government in the early development of the kind of national state council plan for creating a social credit system, as well as in creating sort of local systems like in Shanghai. They had this question of what the consequences for the legal system would be in granting power to joint reward and punishment mechanisms. And as Jeremy brought up, there are definitely some bad laws on the books. What does it mean to kind of expand the power of some of those laws? And what are the consequences for the legal system as a whole? Finally, the third question is something that came up a bit more on Chinese social media in light of a very popular news story this summer about a man who was informed that his son, who was accepted to a prestigious university in Beijing, would not be allowed to attend because this man himself was in debt that he was financially able to repay, but that he chose not to. So the question is, should children be affected if their parents are blacklisted? And this is going to be probably one of the ways in which I think people will even hear of this system, because there are differences of opinion, and it's not clear what the decision on that will be in the future. An interesting debate about this particular question actually was brought up in a book by one of the policymakers in Shanghai who documented the process through which the city thought about and came to developing the regulations. He said, we think about the kinds of dishonest behaviors young people might commit, such as students who cheat on exams at school. This becomes a record at school. But this does not become part of their credit record when they become an adult, because they're not mature yet. They haven't yet developed the moral compass to determine right from wrong. And there are regulations, there are regulations on protecting people who are not yet adults. However, when you think about children having to suffer punishments because of their parents' actions, this questions these pre-existing laws about protecting young people. So I'm going to shift gears here and talk about tech companies in the social credit system, which is primarily what my research is on. I've just documented a few ways in which local regulations are thinking about issues of privacy, of data minimization. However, tech companies are not necessarily being as transparent about whether or not, in cooperating with the state, they too are thinking about these issues. For example, there are about 63 organizations that have signed a memoranda of understanding with China's National Development and Reform Commission, which is the government body that is responsible for coordinating other government bodies and private sector in developing the social credit system. I have chosen a small selection of popular, really well-known Chinese tech companies who have signed one or two types of agreements like this. They're joint rewards and punishments or information sharing. Joint rewards and punishments agreements are basically ones in which these companies will be given state blacklists, and in some cases red lists, which are lists of people who are considered having good behavior or they're exemplary. And they're meant to match up the blacklists with people who use their platforms and then punish those people. So thinking back to the example of how if you're on a judgment defaulter blacklist, you're also effectively on a no-fly list. Well, in the past, it used to be easy to go to a travel agency, try to buy a plane ticket, and that would be the point at which you were blocked. They would say, no, you're on a blacklist. However, now that we have Alipay to pay for everything, these kinds of punishments would have to extend to companies like Alipay. So Ant Financial, Alipay's parent company, in signing this joint rewards and punishments agreement, will then block people from buying plane tickets using their app, buying soft sleeper tickets, buying luxury items, which I'm not a legal expert and I don't know if the law covers that. So this begins to raise the question of how are tech companies devising their own punishments and rewards that are not necessarily covered by the law and that have, to my knowledge, not been publicized in these companies' own terms of service, privacy policies. The other example is, Didi Chuxing is basically the Uber of China. Meituan Dianping is kind of like a mix of Yelp and, food delivery services, and Qihoo 360, it's a huge cybersecurity company. All of these companies have signed information sharing agreements. It is not clear if that means they are sharing their own information with the state, but it is clear that they are taking in information from the government to either enforce punishments or rewards. Now, an example of rewards, Didi Chuxing has signed on to creating a platform with the National Development and Reform Commission called Xinyi. Xinyi sort of translates to kind of credit ease, easy credit. And one of the things they're going to do is take in government red lists to potentially give people who are red listed discounts on taxi rides. When they're calling a taxi, they might be bumped up in the queue so that they can get, a faster service than other people. This is still kind of under discussion, but some reporting in Chinese news media has suggested this is how these kinds of platforms would work. And again, companies are not disclosing in their own policies that they do these things. Like, to even have made this table, I had to go through the National Development and Reform Commission's own press releases because the companies are not necessarily publicizing that they do this. However, at the ceremonies where they sign these agreements, they've made statements about how this is basically a form of social responsibility, of not letting people who are breaking the law get away with it when they use these enormous, ubiquitous private platforms. Some of these are quotes from CEOs from when they sign these agreements saying, we're going to use our big data capabilities to help promote, trustworthiness, joint punishments. And in Ant Financial's case, they talk about their scenarios. So these are situations in which people who have good credit ratings within Ant Financial's Sesame Credit, which, as we have discussed or heard previously, is not necessarily an accurate indicator of financial creditworthiness, but where people with good scores can rent a bike without putting down a deposit, or there are certain purchases they can make at a discount. They can go through kind of expedited check-in processes at hospitals. These are the situations now that people are incentivized to want to have access to these services. You have the co-founder and senior vice president of Meituan Dianping saying a good social credit system is not only the responsibility of relevant government bureaus, it's every industry's, especially platform-based internet companies' responsibility. And again, you see these companies kind of falling in line and echoing that they're doing something responsible by cooperating with the government. This is a page from the Credit China website, which is a kind of Chinese government website collecting news and information about social credit policies, recent developments. So what's interesting about this page is that it's a page where you can look up information related to your personal credit. And the first tab is a link to the People's Bank of China, the central bank. But the next section of these several links are to some of the 8 original companies that were not given licenses to officially run their products as credit services. In my view, this is a way of the state saying, we've reined them in, but we also have to find a way to legitimize what they're doing and to say that we understand it, we can sort of hold some of these companies accountable. This is information that is related to personal credit information rather than counting as that information. And right below it, the next thing I'm going to talk about are 2 examples of city-based credit scoring systems. So again, Jeremy was talking about this educational component where some cities do issue numerical scores. It's interesting that of the, probably several dozen of these now, there are only 2 that are actually on this official website that you can look at. Which brings me to kind of the last arena of public-private cooperation where there is a technological component. There's this phrase being used in China now, credit cities. It's like a remake of the smart city where your score or rating within your city might determine the quality of service and access you have to things like again, renting office space, potentially renting homes, getting at the head of the queue when you check into a hospital. These are very experimental collaborations between municipal governments and tech companies. So in the example in the previous slide, Suzhou is a city in southern China that has partnered with Ant Financial since 2015. Again, this is the company, Ant Financial, that brought us Sesame Credit, Alipay, to create a local scoring system called Osmanthus Points. You can get up to 200 Osmanthus Points. If you're on a blacklist, your score is lowered. If you do things like donate blood or volunteer work, your score is raised. You can access these scores on the website that was linked to, on an app. There's a kiosk you can go to. But thus far, most people don't know about this because it's not really consequential yet. It's not being used for job applications, for determining where you might get to go to university. The rewards are more consequential than the punishments. And frankly, it seems that the punishments are simply not having access to the rewards. Because if you're already on a blacklist, which lowers your score, you're already receiving the punishments of being on a blacklist. The rewards are fairly low stakes. They're things like being able to take out a library book without putting down a deposit. Or some third-party companies are now using this score in that city to try to incentivize people to care about getting a good score. But until these kinds of scores are used for things that are more meaningful in people's everyday lives, they're kind of just experiments meant to sort of play up that the city has really thought about social credit and how to develop it locally. In one instance that I did find, there was a survey asking people how they felt about credit cities. This was conducted with Tsinghua University and Xiaokang Magazine, sort of translates to Wellbeing Magazine. They didn't say how many people they surveyed, readers of this magazine. However, a little over half of the respondents believed that rewards for trustworthy behavior and joint punishments for untrustworthy behavior should be undertaken in constructing credit cities. But then when you look at the results of some of the later questions, it begins to break down. Only a third of those surveyed think that blacklists and red lists should be publicized. And again, blacklists are publicized, traditionally they were in newspapers and they would include a mugshot of someone, maybe their state ID number, their home address, the offense they committed. They used to be in movie previews, but now that everyone has apps, there are some apps that are going to start adopting, using these blacklists as advertisements to really target people where they know their eyeballs are. A little less than a third approve of credit information sharing practices writ large. And again, when we think about this Chinese distinction between public credit information, market credit information, market is such a broad term. When I ask people in interviews, what does this include? They say, things you purchase on Taobao, which is kind of like the Amazon of China. Well, you can see how that definition, market, can continue to expand as various services become digitized. And finally, less than a third support using honesty networks and similar platforms to expose untrustworthy behavior. And what I take to mean network here are these websites, apps, these ways of kind of linking up all of people's kind of data across different platforms to publicize what their behavior, whether they are trustworthy or untrustworthy. What's interesting about this survey is that some of these results suggest that people might have privacy concerns or might not fully favor the way the system is developing. But policymakers have kind of opposing concerns. They're concerned about the quality of the data. They're concerned about if certain implementations of policies are sufficient, if the government is sharing data within its other departments. So they're not really thinking about these issues. In conclusion, I want to focus on some of the things that I see staying the same and some of the places where the policies have not been solidified yet and there might be room for change. The fundamental components that I don't think will change are blacklisting, redlisting, and joint rewards and punishments. These are the backbone of the system. They're what are meant to give the laws teeth, according to certain legal experts and others. I don't think the nature of public-private cooperation will change that much, but it does have the potential to. And I want to stress that public-private cooperation thus far is not about generating new data. It's about sharing data that's already routinely collected for other purposes, both by the government and by tech companies. Definitions of surveillance differ based on who you talk to, but again, a lot of the media accounting makes it seem like there's this constant collection of facial recognition data that will be used in identifying people who jaywalk, other behaviors. That would be new data. That falls outside of what I'm seeing is actually being collected and used in this system. Tech companies are insufficiently disclosing the ways in which they're partnering with the state. That I don't know if that will change, but it is something that needs to be more closely monitored because on the one hand, you have the tech company saying we're doing the socially responsible thing, but on the other, they're not actually explaining how they're doing it and how it affects their provision of services that so many people in China use every single day. Finally, I want to emphasize the system is still in a very experimental and flexible stage. It's marketed as being this panacea for so many market issues, social issues, but it's only likely to mitigate some, right? Food safety is very different from kind of corruption in large companies, different from environmental pollution. I think over time, policymakers are going to have to take a hard look at which issues might actually be solved by this system and which aren't. And it'll be interesting to see what replaces the kind of use cases where this is not effective. Thank you.
Please? You want to
Hello?
stay here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sorry, I have two questions, if possible. First question is, you referred to, in one of the slides, to the possibility of a national privacy law. And I was curious whether that's something that just could come up, or actually you have actually read reports about the possibility of, in news and so on, in your research, you found references to that national privacy law, and to what extent and how, and if you could give more information about this. And the second is, you made reference to a book of one of the guys that sort of handled or created the Shanghai specific code or provisions. I don't recall exactly, sorry. But the Article 14 that you quoted was in certain ways very similar to some of the provisions that we have in the GDPR. Regarding sensitive data. So I was wondering whether you know if there has been any influence, or if they have been looking specifically into that in this regard, because it's actually, well, similar in certain aspects. Thank you.
As for the question about the national privacy law, I'm going to defer to the lawyer. I believe this is on the legislative agenda, but I'm not sure when that would be issued by. But this is, yeah. Do you want to? Okay. Go ahead. Okay, sure. And as for the second question, so the book, in that particular book by Luo Peixin, who works for the Shanghai municipal government, he doesn't mention GDPR. There is a section on privacy, but it totally refers to Chinese privacy kind of like information privacy regulations, right? Not collected under one law. He kind of pulls from different documents. However, there is growing interest in GDPR in China, and just anecdotally from conferences I go to, when GDPR is a discussion topic, you see lots of people taking photos of the slides. So there is potential for influence there in developing a Chinese privacy law. Thanks. Do you know it? Yeah.
Sure.
There is talk of a national privacy law, and we don't know when that might move forward. That said, within existing Chinese laws, there's a great deal of ink spilt over protection of both commercial secrets and personal privacy. Like I said, a key thing to remember, though, is that it's often assumed that government inspectors or police would just preserve the confidentiality of that information. So one thing to remember in discussing privacy is always private from who. And in terms of personal privacy on the internet, in addition to social credit information gathering restrictions, that Article 14 actually came from much earlier rules about collection of public credit information, government collection of information. They do have released standards for personal information on the internet specifically. And China releases two types of standards, some that are not mandatory and some that are compulsory. and you can find those online now. They get put out, and there's several foreign NGOs that are looking at them and analyzing them. And China does consistently look abroad for models, and changes things to suit their national conditions, as they like to say. But yes, foreign models are very influential.
Thank you. Other questions? For the moment, no, but thank you also for coming in again. The next speaker is Lukas Antoine. He's a research associate at Freie Universität Berlin, and since 2017 he works with Professor Genia Kostka on different aspects of the social credit system. The floor is yours. Thank you. You want some coffee? Huh?
Okay. So, in addition to what you already heard from the two previous speakers, I will speak about a bit what the public opinion and citizens' responses to the social credit system or the social credit systems, I must say, is of today. I will first give a short outline of the current status, but keep it very short because we already heard a lot about it. And secondly, outline some of the main results of a study that we conducted in China at the beginning of the year, especially focusing on people's perception of the systems. So, as we already heard beforehand, that there is this government planning outline in 2014 that there was the intention of a basic framework of nationwide social credit systems by 2020, and the basic idea was having a credit rating for individuals, companies, and government bodies, especially focusing on solving specific governance issues, namely the enforcement of judicial decisions, promotion of a particular kind of moralized behavior. We spoke about that earlier. And there are some possible digital components of that, and you could group them in three different directions. So the first one would be recording information, so you use digital technologies to collect and pool existing data. Also CCTV cameras and internet surveillance. The second would be identification and tracking. So you can read a lot about face recognition technologies, but this is not only focusing on China. You have that all over the world, that companies and governments are trying to create those technologies. And the third one would be about analytical intervention, which would be about data analytics, for example, algorithms to transform collected information into knowledge. Some initial media coverage aside, little is actually known about how the system could operate, or like how the systems operate right now. You can see that like there are more and more bits, but as Jeremy Daum already pointed out, it's just like you get confused again when you read another journalistic piece that goes in a totally different direction. So what's the current status? I will not go into detail here because we heard a lot about that earlier. So we have to differentiate between two different kinds of systems. So there's like the government implemented pilot systems that exist in 43 cities, which are rather analog than digital. So you have to imagine that there's like in most of the cities rather paper files than a big digital database. And it's rather a black and white scheme, or like you have to say like black and red scheme. Probably you're either on a black or red list or not, but it's not that you have a score. And then the second element are the financial social credit pilots, which we also heard, which are probably they're very different about like also the perception we heard earlier that the private companies initially got licenses to develop their financial systems, but then they were mainly pursuing business interests, so the licenses were withdrawn. But still those systems exist, and still, as we also heard, we don't know how much information is actually exchanged with also government bodies. So what we did, we also incorporated those systems into our survey to find out how people actually perceive those systems as well. And what we did was, together with Genia Kostka, or under the chair of Genia, I must say, we did an online survey through mobile phone applications and desktop in the beginning of the year. The participants were selected from a survey panel pool from 350,000 users that used different apps. So the survey was implemented in those apps and mobile websites, and we sampled 2,209 citizens with like valid response, like fully responses. And the results are representative for the internet-connected populations in China. And we also added 20 semi-structured interviews in Beijing and Shanghai and some over the phone to get a more insight into the survey findings. You know, when you conduct like quantitative surveys, you sometimes don't really understand what this result is really showing. So to get some more insights, those qualitative interviews were very helpful. And what we can see, first of all, is when you look what people said, what kind of system they were using. Lots of people claimed that they were using the commercial, or they were participating in the commercial systems, commercial credit systems, with Sesame Credit being the most popular. And for the government systems, only 7% of the people claimed to be part of a government pilot. And that was very interesting because we also heard earlier that lots of people are not really aware of being part of a pilot city. And when we compared the geographical location the people lived in with the list we have of like the pilot cities, we see that actually it was 43% of the respondents living in one of the SCSS pilot cities, but not so many were aware of it. So that's also an indicator for that the government-run social credit systems are not yet as advanced as often portrayed. And then we asked people, what do they generally think about having a social credit system implemented? And generally, you can see that most of the citizens approved the idea of having a social credit system, or even strongly approved. And when we asked in more detail what kind of organization they would think would handle personal data most responsibly, most of the respondents said it was the central government. And we also heard that earlier that the private companies were more seen as pursuing their own interests, their own business goals, whereas there seems to be a kind of good trust in the government. And that also shows up when you asked, another question when we asked about what if a nationwide social credit system was implemented, who should run that? And people would trust the central government even more than also local governments, that's also some kind of interesting question, because as of right now, it's more the local governments or the city governments that run their pilots. And then when you look at the demographics, you can see that the approval is highest among the wealthier and better educated citizens, which is probably, when you first hear about it, a bit counterintuitive, because you would think, okay, it's those people when you have like when you're in the middle class and don't have to care about like your money or your daily income, you could get this idea of being more aware of privacy or stuff like that. But it's actually, when you look at how we can explain those benefits, how we can explain those approval rates, it's all about the benefits. So it's the wealthier and better educated people that benefit the most from the system. And obviously, when you benefit from it, you would also approve of it. And especially citizens in urban areas have a far wider access to a range of benefits. So when it comes to the shared bicycle services, we heard the example earlier, or travel. I mean, in rural areas, you just don't have access to those kinds of benefits, even if you would be, if you could get them. And also, there's this different perception, and I think that's probably the most important part. So citizens perceive the social credit system not as an instrument of surveillance, but as an instrument to close institutional and regulatory gaps. There is this belief that a social credit system could improve accountability among firms and individuals, that social credit systems ensure companies to follow regulations and improve the quality of life, to say, overall. And there's also this need, this need for an additional reliable source of information in China's society, where issues like food safety issues or internet scamming or pollution incidents are very common. So they believe, or people believe, that a kind of system could solve those problems. And also, there's this idea that a surveillance instrument is not really necessary, probably, because citizens believe that the Public Security Bureau has other means of control. So, as we heard earlier, there is already lots of data that is stored from citizens, lots of private data. So, why would a government seek to have a new system, to set up a new system when the data already exists? The second part we looked at is what is going on right now. So are the system already changing people's behavior? And that was very interesting, because obviously with a survey like that, you can only report, we can only speak about reported behavior. So we cannot speak about this popular term nudging, because people would probably not even notice if they change their behavior. But right now, when we ask people, okay, have you ever changed your behavior in order to change your social credit score? Lots of people reported yes. I mean, you can see that the vast majority across all groups was very high. And what we can also see, what we then did was like looking into how people believe they changed their behavior or what they intended to do. And it seems to be that those people, I mean, we are only speaking about people who claimed that they were part of a social credit system. So obviously you cannot change your behavior if you're not part of a system. It seems to be that the social credit system rather functions through carrots than through sticks, to use this famous picture. So people believe that that they would change their behavior rather to positively influence their score. And when we looked into more detail again to see, okay, what kind of behavior did people actually change? And now you can see the differentiation of those who are financial users only. So we believe that their answers are concerning system like Sesame, and on the right column is about the government users. So when we have this differentiation, you can see that the financial users often claim to have changed their shopping behavior and to have used the mobile payment app for daily transactions, which is obviously pretty reasonable if you know that the score is calculated from your behavior using their platforms. Whereas the government and financial users claimed that they had volunteered in their local community, for example, and have donated money, which is probably going in a slightly different direction from the financial users. And when we look at those people who said they have suppressed behavior, you can see that the financial ones, or I just want to point out two points which are interesting from my perspective, are they said they shared different content online, which could go in a direction towards some kind of self-censorship. And some people claimed, or 16% of the people claimed that they unfriended people on social media. So it's a debate whether that actually changes whether your friend group, your social group around you is actually affecting your score. But maybe from that rumors already, people decided to delete friends on social media. And when we look at the government and financial users again, lots of people claimed that they had adhered to traffic regulations, which is also very interesting because that really draws into the argument that there was no law enforcement beforehand, and maybe a social credit system could solve that problem. We don't know a lot about how big this behavioral change was, because we only asked, have you ever changed your behavior? That could also be one time. So what we did, because it's so difficult to quantify behavioral change just from like a quantitative analysis, we looked in how many spheres people said they would change their behavior, and you would see that the range of behavioral changes is very limited. So people claimed they had changed their behavior in some areas, but not that many. So we don't really have lots of information as of today in how huge the scope of behavioral change actually is. How can we explain citizens' responses? So far, we only have reported behavioral responses, but they are very limited. So only in a limited number of areas. I named them changes in shopping behavior, more e-payment uses, online posting. And it seems to be that there is some kind of steering of citizens through positive encouragement. So the punitive elements are used very rarely. It's even debated whether they exist on the financial part. Shizida told us beforehand that it's probably also a question of perspective. But that's maybe the most important point is here, lots of citizens might be unaware of some behavioral changes or also unwilling to report them. So you cannot really, just from this survey, it's very hard to draw really conclusions. It's probably just like open new questions for new things. And then obviously there's the question of effectiveness, and effectiveness I'm using here from the government perspective, because does a social credit system, or do social credit systems really reach the right people? Because when we see that like the wealthier and better educated people are changing their behavior and profit from the system, it's the question whether the ones that are actually intended to change their behavior are actually reached. And so there's this question whether a social credit system will really improve compliance or trust in society. And also the questions probably must be raised why the government is using such kind of approach and not focus on education or a better legal enforcement more. And obviously, it also has to be seen how the approval how the general approval might develop if right now there seems to be this perception that the system is fair and it's okay, but what if the punishments increase? Do people still like it, or would they not? And then just to draw some lines, the implications for domestic China, we spoke about that earlier, so it's more like this concern, I mean also why we are meeting here today, and this is why this draws in this. There's like this general concern about the shrinking space for civil society and freedom of speech, and this is why the social credit system also fits into that, because we don't know how far this could go. And the second is, there's just this collection of vast amounts of data which might also affect foreign companies and individuals in China. I mean, it's hard to tell how everything will develop, but obviously it will not stay for Chinese citizens, companies only, and obviously there's like this fear or like China has like this natural laboratory, which this is a phrase which is also like used from media reports, but this is like how is a country using their big data and AI methods in governance? We don't know yet. We will see. And what's the global aspect of it? The question has to be raised whether this could expand to a global level. Chinese firms already right now are expanding vastly and export technologies that could be used to monitor citizens all over the world. We just heard a couple of weeks ago that ZTE is building a mobile phone application system for a new e-identity card in Venezuela. Then also Malaysian police has adopted Chinese facial recognition technology. And also Chinese firms are investing heavily in the e-payment systems abroad, especially in Southeastern Asia, and we can easily imagine that if a company like Alibaba already has a system in China, why should they not export it to other countries as well? So that's also important to monitor. So the main takeaways I wanna leave you with are, at the moment, such a thing as the social credit system does not exist. Secondly, people approve of the current status and see the systems as instruments to close institutional and regulatory gaps. And third, citizens already changed their behavior, but because of the little information and opaqueness of the existing systems, it's very hard to predict future developments, especially since we don't know how digital technologies would fit into that, which are, from my point of view, especially for the future development, very crucial for the implementation on the large scale. And that's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, questions? Yes.
Apologies, it's me again. No, this is more of a curiosity also, because you mentioned, and please take this opportunity to correct if this is stemming from my misconceptions about China and what would you hear about China. But you often refer to, people believe that the central government should do it, and people, have a great approval rate, and they've mentioned that they're changing their behavior. And in one of your conclusions, you mentioned the shrinking space for free speech, and I mean, besides everything that we know about China, and that's the part, if it's not really like that, please, I stand corrected. But what I was wondering was, when you're developing your survey and your hypothesis, did you anticipated a different response? Because it seems that do people really believe, or do they have to believe, or this is somehow a constraint that they are forced to reply in a way that would be accommodating of would give a positive perspective of the system, instead of saying no, or being very critical? Would there be space, or has there been space in your survey for them to actually say, okay, no, we think this is absolute absolutely not working and we feel this invasion of our privacy or other reasons, I don't know. It's just out of curiosity, it's more a personal curiosity. Thank you.
So just from the survey, we actually don't know why people choose to give those answers. I mean, we were when we got the answers or got like the survey results, we were kind of surprised to see this, but obviously you can really draw those conclusions. It's always a question of whether people were really whether people felt comfortable with claiming their own thoughts. I mean, the survey was anonymous, but IP addresses can be tracked, you don't know. But what was very interesting, because we had those qualitative interviews, and that would go in a similar direction, so people would really approve of those systems, because when you have like a personal chat, you would probably expect that people are not that feared of being tracked from wherever. What we got from those interviews, that people were really quite positive and not really that much concerned about privacy and freedom of speech. Yeah. I hope that answers your.
Just a quick follow-up. And is this, in your view or in your knowledge, but also to the other members of the panel, something behavioral or something cultural? Because perhaps my cultural perception of, and this is more a personal interest on the issue, but that privacy was not really a major concern? Is it behavioral in the sense, when you did the interviews, that there was space for criticism, but actually people are their behavior is normally, the tendency is always to give a positive view of things, especially if implemented by local or central government? Or is a cultural thing that really, we think this is how it should be done and this is really the place where, the way to do it?
My impression from that it comes more from a cultural perspective, but I don't know how you would go on that issue.
I have a few comments that I would make, but yeah, I mean,
come in and
yeah. I mean, I'm never a fan of a cultural explanation, because I believe that by and large humans have generally the same concerns. I can say that as far as the privacy concern, Sesame Credit actually got punished by the government at one point because they had an automatic default opt-in option where people it was just pre-clicked, I want to participate. And protections of privacy exist to the point where they got punished. I will say that as far as survey data goes, I think there's a number of interesting things to look at. One is in terms of social credit and the dangers that a point system of any kind might have. We see whenever we look at survey data, no matter how well conducted, that the minute we see numbers labeled, we start to assume there's some sort of truth behind it instead of looking. And when you assign a number to anybody in any capacity, including U.S. financial scores, one naturally starts extending the meaning of it beyond it. But beyond that, the real point I want to make is that on social credit and public opinion in China, the vast majority of people have never heard of it. And I think your data shows that. I, as a person who's researched this for 2 years now, have spent a good amount of time asking Chinese people about the social credit system, including the legal experts. I'm based at a university in China. The legal experts that I know, many of them heard about it for the first time from me. And the Western media, because of its model of this, has actually covered it much more extensively. But a final point is the translation of this phrase social credit, which is an accurate and good translation. But the words could mean a number of other things too. One translation that's possible could be public trust. And were you to do a survey of how do you feel about the system of public trust, well, even without knowing it, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find people that are like, oh, no, I don't think we should have public trust. So I think that's probably one of the issues, is the format. But I think there probably is some less familiarity with taking surveys given by people you don't know in China. It's not as common, and there are laws restricting who can do survey research and when. So it might make people more apprehensive.
Thank you. Other questions for the moment? Thank you. Our next speaker is Director of Research in Political Science, Johann Wolfgang Goethe Universität in Frankfurt.
Is yours PDF?
No, I think it's the PowerPoint.
Just with the arrows up and down.
Okay, thank you very much, both for organizing this conference and also for inviting me, obviously. So basically, I am going to start where Lucas just ended, so with the international implications of social credit rating. So specifically, I changed my title not to talk about specifically the social credit system, because I think previous speakers were right in pointing out that there are many different things going on right now, and it's hard to say how much of this will eventually be brought under the centralized, centrally planned unified social credit system. So I'm talking about international implications of existing credit ratings and credit scores. So first of all, well, my general question that I'm trying to answer in this presentation is the potential and already happening international implications and possible ways of diffusion of the state-run social credit system and related private credit rating systems in China. My talk is going to be structured in 3 parts. First, I'm going to mention the international references that are already built into the social credit system according to the initial policy document. Then I'm going to present what I think are 4, or can be classified into 4 potential and real pathways for the internationalization and globalization of Chinese social credit mechanisms. And then, in the end, raise some what I think are important implications for European decision makers, both in politics but also in business and civil society. If we look at the, I would say, most authoritative document that exists and that has been published by the State Council in 2014, which is the original planning outline for building a social credit system by 2020, then when specifically looking for international and global references, it reads as if the social credit system really has this international ambition. So I translated some of these mentionings. It is presented as a necessary condition for increasing China's soft power and international influence, as an urgent requirement for building an objective, fair, rational, and balanced international credit rating system, as a means of strengthening the international influence of China's credit rating agencies, so existing and developing, and of promoting their participation in international competition, and also strengthening harmonization and cooperation with other countries' systems. So this might read like the international component is really important in that. However, it is a very long document, and these are short references in a long document. So it needs to be put into perspective. And in a study we did together also with Shazida Ahmed and Mareike Ohlberg at the Mercator Institute for China Studies last year, we specifically looked into existing international references in Chinese debates about the implementation of the social credit system to date. And what we found actually is that for now, the international dimension receives very, very limited attention. So you can see that the word international or global only appears in 16% of all articles that discuss the social credit system in China. In the headline, only in 1%, so it's not a main topic. And even among those articles which discuss international aspects, they tend to focus on issues like IPR protection in international business, the International Consumer Protection Day, or local level governments wanting to internationalize their business through the social credit system. So this, what you just saw with international references to soft power and influencing global norms isn't discussed at all. And we can also find from policy plans or specific implementation plans that in clear contrast to other related concepts like internet sovereignty, which China under Xi Jinping has started to push heavily for on the global scene as a Chinese countermodel to existing Western ways of governing the internet, or also the idea of e-payments and cashless society, where China and also Chinese propaganda actively promotes this as China being most advanced here and being a model for other countries. For the social credit system, it hasn't been discussed today as an innovative Chinese model of governance for other countries to be emulated. And so we concluded at the end of 2017 in our study that today Chinese authorities seem far more concerned with implementing and legitimizing this very complex system domestically than with these international references. Nonetheless, I think it is worth and it is important for Europe, also considering how fast all of this develops, it's really important at this stage already to think about the possible ways through which China's social credit ratings might or are already impacting the world and Europe more specifically. And I think this can be broken down into four possible ways of expansion. The first, and I think most immediate, is via foreign actors in China, because obviously, as a foreign citizen living in China, but even more so as a business, which needs a Chinese business license, you're obviously subject to Chinese laws. And as Jeremy has pointed out, the social credit system is not so much about making new requirements or making new laws, but about improving and smoothing enforcement. I think that's a point that needs to be stressed. This algorithm-based enforcement is about making enforcement of existing regulations more automatic and having actors self-enforce, basically, because they anticipate negative ratings that they basically China doesn't even, or the Chinese authorities don't even need to punish anymore eventually. But that foreign actors, as well as Chinese companies, will anticipate possible punishments or possible reductions of their scores once they are possibly implemented, I have to say. As of 2018, and here you can see how fast things move, because since we published our study a year ago, a lot has changed already, and I had to slightly modify, I think, also my conclusions in that regard. Foreign companies are now being brought under a social credit framework, but so far mostly theoretically. So by January this year, they have been assigned this 18-digit unified social credit code, which is meant to help data exchange and give every actor this unified number to be identified, which is basically also a way to fight against the current data islands where every agency and private and state actors have their own data and can't really share them in an efficient way. For nonprofits, this had also started in, I think, June or July 2018. So in theory, they have this number now and can be brought under the system, but it's still unclear, I think, for most actors what implications this will eventually have. Now, what is definitely already happening is that some multinationals have been sanctioned for political misconduct, also with reference to specific credit regulations. Here again, you can discuss whether this is specifically part of the social credit system, and I think Jeremy will say it's not. For example, the example of the international aviation industry, which has received letters by aviation regulators to not refer to Taiwan as a country anymore, but specifically refer to Taiwan and the China destinations, was with reference to new regulations in December 2017, which were meant to implement the social credit management system in this sector. And obviously there are plentiful examples of other threats to individual companies, Marriott Hotels and Daimler being other prominent examples this year, where companies are openly threatened for political misconduct. Again, this is not a new thing. So companies active in China have been pressured to obey with these principles before, but it's a way in which we could think this could become more automatic and more algorithm-based in the future. Another, I think, really consequential event, also in light of the general situation or working environment for civil society actors, Foreign NGOs and non-profits in a wider sense have already been brought under a new legal framework by 2017, which is the Foreign NGO Management Law, which is a lot more restrictive in many regards than the previous gray areas in which they were working. And they have all been assigned now or had to find a supervisory unit, a Chinese supervisory unit. Now, taking the example of Germany's political foundations, so Friedrich Ebert, Konrad Adenauer, Heinrich Böll, etc., many of them, apart from the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, have been assigned the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries as a supervisory unit. And there has been a media report this year, and I think it's well justified, that these supervisory units sent out specific instructions to the German political foundations, which behavior will result in how many plus and minus points in their credit or credit scoring. Again, it's not clear if this is part of a unified social credit system or whether this friendship association is setting up its own system with reference to credit management. But the principle of assigning bonuses and maluses for convenient behavior, and in this case it's obviously for political behavior. For example, you get extra points if you say positive things about the Communist Party. It's as explicit as this. And you get minus points if you threaten China's unity, for example, which is obviously a way of saying if you have critical events about Taiwan or Xinjiang or related issues. So, as other speakers have pointed out before, many things are yet unclear, so I think these are just 3 points where we can't be sure yet. We don't know whether foreign companies will be systematically evaluated in the future for correct behavior. We're not sure, maybe Jeremy knows more as a resident of Beijing, but we're not sure to what extent foreign citizens in China will be brought under the scoring system, and I don't know of any case where foreign citizens would have been blacklisted according to the social credit system. And I think more consequential is the question to what extent activities outside China, so for example, events being organized in Europe, would influence an institution's ratings in China. So just think of the example of a European NGO with China activities organizing a what would be perceived as an anti-China event here in Europe. Whether this would automatically lead to deductions of points within China, we don't know. The second avenue that you can think of is government-driven policy transfer, which is, as I said, is happening in issues like internet sovereignty, where China is organizing the World Internet Conference to actively promote its model on the global scene. Well, due to the domestic presentation of the social credit system as this tool for better and service-oriented governance, for anti-fraud, for anti-corruption, plus what Lucas has pointed out, the apparent popularity among China's middle class, this in conjunction obviously makes the system a potentially very attractive tool for other authoritarian governments to imitate. In how far is China secretly advancing this or transferring or promoting this model? Again, we don't know. There's some anecdotal evidence about workshops where officials from other countries are invited to China to learn about this. There are obviously related issue areas. For example, the National Supervisory Commission is doing workshops on anti-corruption for African officials. And since the social credit system is promoted as an effective, specifically Chinese way of fighting corruption, it's likely that it's going to come up in these related workshops as well. But again, I think it is not a policy focus for China currently to promote its system to other countries. And finally, we can also see this in the broader context of more assertive control policies being deployed or increased control over overseas Chinese communities, policy documents by the United Front Department, which is responsible for managing Chinese communities abroad. But there's no specific reference to the social credit system so far, so this is really only a potential avenue of internationalization. Then the third aspect, I think, has been mentioned also by Lucas already, so I'm going quickly over this. obviously the still booming overseas investment along the Belt and Road Initiative, where often Chinese development finance comes with content requirements, where Chinese firms are meant to implement infrastructure investments, provides another avenue for distribution. The so-called digital Silk Road has become a new buzzword in China, where for example, along railroads, optical fiber cables are being deployed across BRI target countries. And here, obviously, both state-owned and private Chinese companies are rather advanced compared to Western competitors in deploying these cables. There's a clear strategic dimension for China here because they want to become or shield their own data streams from Western espionage. That's openly assumed. It's a national security concern. And obviously, you can infer the other way around that these lines might not be shielded from Chinese espionage. How far this hardware or infrastructure expansion expands to software applications is more of an open question, I think. I would agree with Lucas that financial services infrastructure is the most likely way of diffusion here, and financial being the main player internationally with its huge growth plans for specifically South America, but also Southeast Asia. So you can easily imagine once cross-border remittance services or online payment services have been adopted by foreign users, it's easy to offer them additional perks through, for example, Sesame Credit or other systems. And this leads to the final avenue, consumer-driven expansion. The possible proliferation of Chinese credit apps and cashless payment service simply because they're better and therefore adopted voluntarily by foreign users. In Europe, it's happening currently mainly through the incentive of Chinese tourism. So more and more European businesses are offering Alipay payment facilities to attract Chinese customers. So these services are expanding, and this is not a problem per se, of course not. But this is another possible avenue through which, again, you could have rewards for citizens or people with good credit ratings to purchase in Europe, etc. And then there's this whole bunch of lower-level, privately market-driven technological innovation in China with new lending companies, P2P services, which are spreading quickly and even too quickly for Chinese regulators. So be assured when we talk in Europe about slow regulation, I think a lot of this is also evolving too fast for Chinese regulators. There have been several or manifold privacy abuse scandals by new companies like Yongqianbao, which allows peer-to-peer lending and assesses people's credibility also based on a whole range of also invasive private information. And also what we found in our study last year is that these instances are much more openly and much more critically discussed in Chinese media than government-related privacy abuses. So in this case, the current state or the current poor state of privacy issues in these startups mostly may hinder internationalization simply for reputational issues, but it's a thing that's developing very fast and which obviously in China, due to the banking system's limitations, is still very popular and growing. So let me finally come to implications for European decision makers. I think if we look at the current EU-China power balance, and you can talk about other issues, also human rights more generally, we have to accept that the means of influencing the domestic implementation of the social credit system in China are very limited. It's about enforcing rules, and obviously China has the right to enforce its own rules on its territory. So I'm not saying this is not an important issue, but we have to be clear that from a European perspective, the means of influencing this, it's going to come in whatever way. They are limited. However, I think it's important really to be concerned with the system's potential and both intended and unintended spillover effects, and also to keep in mind this, this pressure on foreign actors, which is already happening to abide by CCP ideological principles, and which is expanding beyond China's borders in recent years, simply due to China's growing international presence and growing international power, and not necessarily because of the social credit system, but it's happening in conjunction. So I want to re-emphasize my point that whereas the social credit system doesn't necessarily add to this political pressure, it could make this form of pressure more sophisticated, more automatic, algorithm-based, and thereby also reduce the reputational costs for China. Now, every time a foreign company recedes in front of Chinese pressure, for example, Daimler in February, when they retweeted a Dalai Lama quotation on their Instagram, they get a massive or a sizable international backlash for that. In the future, we could think that companies are just automatically adapting their behavior so as not to jeopardize their scores, and reputational costs for both foreign companies and for the Chinese government would be significantly lower. So what could be done from a European perspective, I think? One is the more general point of better shielding European companies, but also non-profits from external pressure. Since this is a system that does affect and will affect foreign citizens and companies, it's important to diplomatically request more clarity from authorities. You can see that all of us who are here as experts are still unsure about many of the points, and because simply there's no information on it. So through diplomatic channels, it's really important to request clarity on how this will affect foreign actors in China. And one could also consider a voluntary Europe-wide reporting system to get more clarity about what European companies, European NGOs are experiencing, how they're being approached by authorities, etc. And finally, because it's always easy to point the finger, and specifically regarding social credit ratings, I think looking at the many similarities that the financial credit rating systems have to existing systems in the US, like FICO, but also SCHUFA in Germany. If Europe wants to exert its normative power internationally here, then we need to work on our own systems and strengthen transparency and data protection in Europe's own rating systems to position them as a clear alternative. Because for now, algorithms are not known in SCHUFA in Germany either. There have been recent scandals also about how SCHUFA treats people or rates people. So if we want to promote international standards, we should start in Europe and then possibly try to influence international standards for credit ratings that exclude discriminatory criteria, such as, for example, the guilt by association, where your friends on social media influence your credit rating. I think such things should be excluded, and Europe would do well in offensively promoting these standards based on change of own behavior here in Europe. Thank you very much.
Very much. And also thank you for bringing us back to our work, what we can do and what we have to envisage. Our last speaker is Lin Fei Fan, and we were discussing the role of civil society in China. So coming from very close place to China, how do you see these developments? And we'd be very curious to hear your observations. You also need the, yeah? Okay.
Yeah. So okay. If you click on it, and then we do Central F, you double click, and then Central Belt.
Central. Okay. Yeah. Sure. Right. Okay.
So Control L.
Control.
Yeah. Sorry. Control L. Yeah.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay.
And you can use the arrows to go up and down.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and it's
my pleasure to be here to provide probably not directly linked to the social credit system, but more about the implications that the social credit China's social credit system would affect Taiwan, or a lot of speakers actually already addressed that social credit system would have the implication for like foreign companies. And so I would focus on these two main points that and it's already happening in Taiwan, and Taiwan has already faced this kind of pressure from China. So one aspect I will address is the direct threat to Taiwan sovereignty that we already addressed in these panels a lot of times. And the second aspect is the human rights violations that already happened on Taiwanese citizens. While I have to say that, like Jeremy has said, that these kind of effects already happen, but it's not directly caused by the social credit system. But the social credit system, how they would probably strengthen this kind of influence. Yeah. Okay. So first of all, that the so-called Orwellian nonsense that already been addressed by the White House, that talking about the foreign companies being threat to amend their description on Taiwan and to be like part of China, or kind of like Taipei, or erase any kind of symbol or any kind of names of Taiwan. So this one is the China's Aviation Council, that they already, in this year, in April, they already sent a kind of notice to 44 airline companies and to request them to amend the description on Taiwan. So, but it got this like an extension for the deadlines. First of all, they request that all those companies have to amend their description on Taiwan like in a month. But after the deadline, they reached the deadline in May, and they found that some of the companies still haven't changed their description on Taiwan, so they extend the deadline again. But there's a lot of negotiation and a lot of penalties, or a lot of threats, carrots and sticks in this process. But finally, in this July, that all 44 airlines companies already kind of kowtow to Beijing's pressure. Then they already accept this kind of pressure and change their description on Taiwan. While in different forms, like some companies in U.S. that they change Taiwan's name as just simply Taipei, or they just erase Taiwan. But a lot of European airline companies, including Air France, including Lufthansa, including British Airways, they already changed Taiwan's name as Taiwan China. So this is already happened in Taiwan right now. But this kind of pressure is not only happened in the airway companies, but also a lot of different sectors and different business sectors. For example, that we can see that Muji, a Japanese company as well, they also been pressured to change the description on Taiwan, because they found that some of their products have the tag that says the products come from Taiwan or made in Taiwan. So they're just being fined for like 20 and more, 20,000 pounds already. So not only for like business sectors, but also in education sector as well. We already saw a lot of universities in Europe and also in United States, when Taiwanese students have to register their studentship, they have to be named as, they have to file their nationality under like Taiwan, China. And so this is also another case that already happened. But another thing is that for another education sector also being affected is like international, like IELTS tests. I know that probably right now the TOEFL test, the for English test, TOEFL have been affected by this Chinese pressure. You still can find the nationality of Taiwan. But like IELTS, the British company, the International English Language Testing System, has already changed Taiwan as Taiwan, China. So a lot of cases has already shown that China is giving a lot of pressures on like foreign companies for this political reason or political aims. But would this kind of effect that will be strengthened by the social credit system if the foreign companies invest in China more and more? Will they facing those kind of pressure or losing their scores by the social credit system because they claim Taiwan as it's not part of China, or they have a different description from China's perspective on Taiwan, will also have this kind of influence? That's one thing that would probably we should keep an eye on it. But another case that will address is Li Mingzhe's case. I have to say it again and again because it's another kind of a very important issue in Taiwan, and it's become one of the person that being forgotten by a lot of the massive majority, not only in Taiwan but also in the international community as well. I have to introduce him, but because Li Mingzhe is just a kind of a pure social activist in Taiwan and participating in a lot of civil movements, social movements. But he also did a lot of like online course on WeChat, on QQ, and those Chinese app, dialogue app like Facebook or something. One thing he was doing is actually criticizing Chinese government online on Weixin and QQ and Facebook. But he just been arrested and detained by the Chinese government last year in last March, and it's now being 1.5 years right now. But why his case is important and also kind of we can think about the implication for on the social credit system is because the prosecution document actually document about his use of Facebook in criticizing Chinese authority. So he been charged as the kind of attempts to the subversion of the state regime, and being sentenced for 5 years right now. So, but he's a Taiwanese activist. So he's also the first one after the Chinese government passed the foreign NGO regulation. New regulation on foreign NGOs. So he's been the first case of a foreign citizens being affected by that law. But it also shows that if he uses the Facebook, that would affect his rights or being a kind of evidence for his kind of criminal attempts. Then would it be affect to the other social movement activists or other people or other NGOs or members from NGOs as well? So that's another question that we should keep eye on it. So, but yeah, so now his case, because he's already been sentenced for 5 years, recently a new update is that he's been transferred to another jail without any notice to his family. It's also kind of in Taiwan we consider it's also it's also a violation of the international protocol as well. Another case that I think the social credit system might affect Taiwan is their new policy for the new resident ID policy they offer to Taiwanese, the citizens from Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan. And recently, in September, they launched this new scheme and claiming that there are 20,000 Taiwanese citizens already registered for the kind of residentship in China. But during the process, they also request people from Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan to provide the personal details, and also they have the obligation to pay the tax to the Chinese government as well. So once you decide to apply this kind of residentship, then you are being requested to pay the tax. But during this process, would the social credit system also affect Taiwanese citizens as well, or they were recording or kind of scoring Taiwanese citizens as well? That's another thing that we probably also need to be aware. So all those things that has already happened, but not directly linked to the social credit system, but we still can find Taiwan as a front line, standing on the front line to counter China or to face the pressure of China directly. That we really recommend that more and more the international community or foreign government to keep an eye on that. And one thing that we should to think about is how to protect the foreign companies from China's coercion. But another thing is that Taiwan is a democratic nation, that we are facing such a pressure from China, and also has already been kind of damaged and harmed directly by China's aggression or this kind of assertion. We really urge that the international community can strengthen ties with Taiwan and probably share more experience with Taiwan and how to cooperate with Taiwanese government and also civil society to strengthen our ability or capacity to counter this kind of influence. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. So we have some time left. We have already prepared the drinks, I think. So, but it should not hinder you from raising questions and also for remarks on more general remarks. I think we had a long afternoon and we really could go into detail and could really see the developments and at various different angles.
I'd be happy to make a comment about
yeah.
the last two speakers as well.
And I forgot actually to ask you for raising questions to Bertram. Yeah, sorry for that. I was already excusing myself. So those two final last speakers are now ready for your questions, and we can also then come up with general remarks. So who wants to? Normally you raise the.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah, sure. So, yes, please. Yeah, Jeremy.
I'd like to take a minute to address the situation of the airlines and Taiwan nomenclature, because it's an interesting example that's come up a few times today even, but even more in media. And I actually wrote a brief article about it at one point because it was coming up so frequently. It's interesting because the reason it gets tied to social credit, as both of our speakers who brought it up have mentioned, these laws about how Taiwan should be referred to and national unity as China views it pre-exist any notion of social credit. But the reason it gets linked to social credit is because in the letter that was sent to these airlines telling them to change the way it was referred to, they mention social credit rules run by the Civil Aviation Administration of China. Now, it's interesting because the reason they mentioned social credit in that is because of due process. They're required to give notice in advance of the possible consequences. So to me, that's much less an example of it using social credit as a threat as an example of them trying to make it a compliant system. Now, those laws that it was enforcing and that they were enforcing, I said earlier, I don't like. But that's what social credit does, is it provides a way to enforce. Now, it's an interesting example, too, because it shows one of the ways that this system that mainly regulates organizations can, in fact, get to individuals. And that's because once an administrative agency makes a judgment in its administrative capacity against a corporation, and then it would seek enforcement with the courts if that fine or act requirement that an act be taken not be met, they would go to the courts and get an enforcement decision. Once the enforcement decision isn't followed through on, then you're on that judgment defaulters list of the courts that I mentioned. And not only is the organization on it, but certain members of the board are on it as well, including actual controllers, people directly responsible, and the listed legal representative. So this is a way that organizations' responsibility in China could quickly lead to personal responsibility. Now, an interesting thing is that while I think that's actually one of the most invasive things about the social credit system, this piercing of the corporate veil, I think it would actually be less controversial abroad. I think many in the U.S., at least, would actually embrace such a system, as there's frequently public opinion complaints that CEOs and whatnot get away with horrific actions. But it's an interesting case because of that. Now, I think the most interesting thing to me about that case, though, is corporate responsibility. We hear about coercion of corporations. It should surprise no one that corporations are interested in keeping the China market open to them. Corporations exist for the sake of making money. That's their sole reason to exist. When we talk about putting pressure to make them comply with laws, to make them comply with rights obligations, frequently we talk about, well, the consumers need to make clear that we're not going to buy it if you don't comply. I never heard, and I have not tried to interview an airline. I don't want to imply that I did. But I've never heard that the airlines even said, well, what are the consequences if I fail to do this? I never heard, although some have said that there were discussions, that they tried to say, what if I make my China website compliant? So in China, everyone would get routed to a website that listed Taiwan, China, and everyone else would go to a normal one. China doesn't have jurisdiction beyond its borders. And we've seen with European privacy law that some American websites are no longer available. They have a warning that comes on and says, we're so sorry, we would love to provide you our content, but we use cookies in a way that's not acceptable. What if they did that? What if they made it so, yes, you can still call the business office of the airline in China, but sorry, we just don't have a website right now to avoid listing Taiwan in any way? We don't know the answers to this. Some people have said, China said, if you have a website anywhere, we're going to have consequences for you. I think that would be a much more controversial stance for China to take, and I don't think China would take it easily. They might say it in negotiations, but the legal basis for such a rule would be really thin. So you know, what steps were taken? I know, you know, Quebec in Canada's French language laws resulted in some businesses, I think Pottery Bar, said we don't have a French site, we don't have the resources to do it, so please come visit our store instead. What if the airlines did this? The answer is they're not interested in doing that. They decided that Taiwan was not a cause that they would raise.
Thank you. Who wants to take the floor? People look a little bit tired. Yes, please. Thank you.
Axel Heyer from the DG Communication here of the European Parliament. A question to the panel, maybe to the experts that spoke lastly also about the export, let's say. When do you expect some state-driven social credit systems within the European Union? Because that is a perspective, also a challenge for you. What is your guess? Of course, it's not scientifically now very clearly to say, but do you have an idea or a perspective for us to give?
Just to clarify, you mean driven by the Chinese state or no? By EU states. Oh, that is probably much more your expertise than my expertise. No, I don't want to. I can't answer on that as an expert because I'm really not an expert on European digital regulation. So I prefer to stick to projections about how the Chinese system might develop.
Yes, please.
So several of us have suggested we don't think something like this would come from China to Europe. And one of the questions someone posed to me once was, well, Alipay is extending its services throughout Europe. Surely they would also extend their credit rating service as well. And I said, I don't actually think so because of GDPR's explainability clauses. So because that company cannot even in China provide an explanation of how they generate the scores that they do. This is a challenge that I think trying to create something like a social credit system would raise in Europe as well. And I think just the almost insurmountability of that could make it very difficult for any company or organization to do. Also, I think a lot of the explanations we provided today explain how something like social credit is so rooted in pre-existing institutions in China. And unless you can think of an example of a European state that has really similar institutions that are trying to solve similar problems the same way, I don't really see it happening here.
I think in answer to that question, while I am in no way an expert on the EU, but I think it depends on what you mean by social credit system. And in the way that I break it down to that educational, financial, and regulatory components, my guess is that it already largely exists. The U.S. financial credit system certainly expands into some uses that I think people would love to call Orwellian nonsense, as the U.S. government called the Chinese rules on Taiwan. We need to control how the information is used as well as what information goes into it. The regulatory system, I think, at its heart, is really fairly standard administration in governance in China's system right now. The U.S. law actually recently announced a cooperation between the IRS and State Department that is very similar to the blacklisting and joint memorandum system of China's, where people who owe a certain amount of tax dollars, so serious violators, as the Chinese law would seem, will have their passports affected and canceled. Now, what happens if you're abroad? I'm sure there'll be some constitutional issues, but it's very much the same system, joint enforcement. For the court rules in the U.S., frequently your driver's license will be suspended if you have an outstanding court judgment. Something I've found is even more irrational than many of the parts of the Chinese high consumerism expenses, because if you owe a financial judgment, it's quite hard to earn money in the U.S. without a car. That is a question employers ask, even if they don't ask your credit score. So it depends on what it means. I think, just to take a step back, talking about what the definition of social credit is, you hear even in our conversation, although we started all nodding in agreement when I say there is no score, we still hear us slipping into the language of adding points, taking away points. And there are some scores within certain fields, but I believe that the mythos of a social credit score instead of a disparate environment of social credit systems is so pervasive that even the experts tend to fall into it. And I think the real question that we have to ask, and I'm saying this in part by way of conclusion and summary of everything we've said today, how did we get to this point, and what is the impact of this level of misunderstanding? Because it really doesn't make much sense. If you think about a unified credit score, something that really measured every aspect of your life, it's not useful. Right? I mean, when you lend someone money, you want to know about their ability to return the money. When you go buy food at a restaurant, you want to know about the sanitation in that restaurant. If you find out that, well, this person's restaurant is incredibly filthy and 6 people got food poisoning last week, but he does a lot of charity work and visited his grandma 3 times, that's not helpful to you. Unified scores defeat big data. They aren't the result of big data. Data is about usefulness and being particularized. The police in China have access to a lot of data, but they want to look at your ability, whether you're going to commit crimes, whether you're likely to be the guilty party. So I'm not terribly worried about universal scores because I don't think it makes sense, and it's also just not terribly practical. One thing that people forget in describing this sort of dystopia is dystopia is hard. I mean, that sounds like a lot of resources and infrastructure with not great results. If you start banning every citizen from riding airplanes and trains, well, your economic impact of that is not going to be what you desire. So, how do we get here in terms of this level of misunderstanding? Part of it is China's fault. part of it is the Western media's fault. China inflates its use of technology. They do this for a number of reasons. They do it in foreign media stories that they write in English that is written by state media about things like facial recognition activated toilet paper dispensers, police wearing Google Glass to recognize people's faces. They do this for a number of reasons. One is for domestic consumption when the articles aren't in English, and that is part of that bugan that I put up, the be afraid to make offenses. They want people to think you can't get away with doing bad stuff, and I don't think that's such a uniquely Chinese situation. Local governments, we heard mentioned, do it because they want the central government to think they're implementing rules well. And they do it for an international audience as well, because the China model of governance, if not specific technologies, is very much something that's being packaged to go abroad. And the idea that these capacities exist in China helps legitimize that model, especially for other developing nations. On the foreign media side, that fake news, which is the other dystopia I mentioned, the dystopia we may be closer to, I had a reporter friend tell me that there's only 3 stories on China you can publish: China big, China bad, China wacky. And if you can combine 2 of those, China big and bad, China bad and wacky, then it's a story with legs. Social credit gets all 3. And that's why it's continued for 2 years that have been globally politically tumultuous. And this story has, lasted as long as Brexit coverage has now, and doesn't seem to be wavering despite its lack of basis in reality. So I think that there are a lot of questions about the use of technology that will have to be evaluated globally. China's situation may change. I will dutifully report on it if it does. But as of now, I think the global issues are what we need to be considering in terms of this, including how we report and what our interests are. And I'll end by saying on that note that a reporter recently, when I criticized an article, told me that they had thought it was quite balanced. And I told them that that's not my standard for looking at an article. I'm looking for accurate and informative, which the article was not accurate. And they said balanced was what they're told their goal is. And I think we need to work on that as well.
Yes, thank you very much. I think this topic deserves more discussion, and apparently this is not the case yet. We are just still in this game of just discussing interesting things, and you're right, we have a certain attention to developments from China which are not always correct, which might be correct to some extent, but it deserves more and deeper consideration. There's of course also, I think, the chance or the threat, whatever, of intrusion from the Chinese model to Europe. We saw a lot of different angles where that might happen. The question still, what does it mean if it affects Europe? So there can be also maybe positive effects, or at least effects we could investigate. But still, it's an open question. And for Europe, coming back to the European Parliament and what our contribution was, it is actually that we had been, over the last 5 years, the leader in data protection. So European Parliament, together with European Commission, set the standards for privacy globally. So many global companies are now complying to GDPR, and if you go to Silicon Valley, everybody assures you GDPR is something positive for them. They would have never done if there would not have been a contribution from Europe. So I think for us Europeans, it is also important to look into this and to look into these possibilities. And I have I remember some remarks of all of you where you were actually also using the element of privacy in your talk. So this is also a problem in China, or it is something which is interesting for them. But there is no dialogue, there is no discussion on this. So if we could have at least achieved some kind of departing elements in the discussion between China and Europe, this would be very important, and it is not just so easy as it looks at the moment. It's not only a threat, or it's not only opportunity, it is something we have to work on it. So there will be some more minutes then joining us for a drink where we can informally develop these ideas, and I want to thank you very much for coming, for your contributions, also for our interpreters for doing their work. Thank you very much, and see you sometime, somewhere again. Thank you. It is not as easy. You're right. You have this. Yeah, what is it? Bad?
It's very hard.
Is it
China big, China bad, China wacky.
yeah, something. Yeah.
It's very hard to get past.